So a very warm welcome to today's lecture by our guest speaker, Catalin-Stefan Popa, who joins us today from Bucharest, and whom I have the great pleasure to welcome and to introduce. Catalin-Stefan Popa is a professor in church history at the School of Advanced Studies at the Romanian Academy in Bucharest, and a scholar at the Institute for the History of Religions. He holds a PhD from Georg August Universität Göttingen, Germany, 2016, and he received in 2021 his Venia Legendi, the habilitation from the University of Graz in Austria, where he also teaches now as Privatdozent. Dr. Popa was also a fellow of Ben Gurion University of the Negev, Beersheba, Israel, and he is furthermore associated with the Institute for Advanced Studies in Levant Culture and Civilization in Bucharest. Dr. Popa also serves as founding editor-in-chief of the Syriac Annals of the Romanian Academy, published by the Department of Historical Science and Archaeology of the Romanian Academy. Dr. Popa published extensively on Syriac and Oriental ecclesiastical history, exegesis, and literature in the late antique and medieval periods, including his 2016 monograph in German on Georgis I, Patriarch of the Church of the East from 661 to 680, entitled Georgis I, Ostsyrische Christologie in frühislamischer Zeit. He further edited 3 collective volumes and published close to 50 articles. His most recent monograph was published earlier this year with Routledge, The Making of Syriac Jerusalem, Representations of the Holy City in Syriac Literature of Late Antiquity and the Middle Ages. A close analysis of hagiographic, historiographical, hymnological, and theological sources that contributed to the formation of the sacred picture of the physical as well as the metaphysical Jerusalem in the literature of East and West Syrians. And today's talk touches upon the topic of this recent book. Now, just a few housekeeping rules. This is a hybrid event, so we have the people, the audience that is here, again, a warm welcome. And we have about 40 to 50 participants who are online. And I kindly ask the online participants to keep themselves mute during the talk. And of course, during the discussion, we can accommodate questions both from the audience in the room as well as those online. And without further ado, Catalin, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. I feel tremendously honored to make this speech in front of you. First of all, I want to express my sincere thanks to Professor Sabine Schmidtke for inviting me as a speaker within the event series Islamic Near Eastern Studies Historical School at the Institute for Advanced Study here in Princeton. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to address your wonderful audience, both in person and virtual. Hieronymus wrote in his letter 108 to Eustochium the following rhetorical question. Quote, "For what race of men is there which does not send pilgrims to the holy places?" Unquote. Reading this point raised by the famous Western Church Father and Pilgrim, one can posit that Syriac Christians, like most of the Eastern Christian communities, have been attracted by the holy places, Jerusalem being for them a matrix for encountering holiness. Syriac monks and lay people traveled as pilgrims to the holy city to pay devotion. They established communities in the Holy Land, and until the time of the Crusades and beyond that, the Syriac-speaking communities in Palestine flourished, and they concentrated nexuses of ecclesiastic power through both supporting and establishing monastic centers and anointing bishoprics. What I am going to talk about today is to elaborate on this substantial and transversal trajectory of Syriac Christians towards the Holy City. My presentation is divided into 5 main parts. First, I am going to describe the eve of the phenomenon that starts with the Syriac hagiography, and then I'll move on to look at more historical texts, specifically at the beginning of Syriac bishoprics and institutions in the Holy Land. Next, I will offer a picture of the Syriac Orthodox community in the Holy City in late medieval period based on some colophons. Then I will look at more colophons and travel reports of late medieval and Ottoman period. And finally, I will give you some brief information about the pilgrimage ritual as imagined in some canons of Bar Hebreus in the 13th century. If one looks at the lives of famous late antique Syriac church leaders, one can find out that the search for Jerusalem appears as a station in the Reformation, the pilgrimage being an ordinary custom for advanced Christian life and for monastic canon. One example is the Bar Sauma ascetic and archimandrite of 5th century with his 4 legendary pilgrimages that portrays him as an atypical pilgrim and atypical monk. Whatever the intention of the author was in the hagiographic description of his hero, some elements dealing with the phenomenology of pilgrimage to Jerusalem are evident. You can see here on the slide different information from these 4 legendary pilgrimages of Bar Sauma to Jerusalem, how he made the first pilgrimage as a teenager, then with a group of 40 people, then with 100 people. So with this symbolic number of companions and many other information, how he fought for his identity in the Holy City, for the identity of his confession in the Holy City. Another significant Syriac character to evoke here is Rabula of Edessa, a contemporary of Bar Sauma. The Bishop of Edessa was a personality fully involved in the Syriac confessional struggles. We read in his life that he came in contact with the Holy City in the early stages of his Christian formation. He followed a generic pilgrimage itinerary of the holy places, at the Holy Sepulchre, at the site of Ascension, at the River Jordan, and many other biblical places. The theme of Syriac pilgrimage, which we can identify sometimes in Syriac literature with the concept Axenaiuta, Syriac pilgrim being also Axenaia, perpetuates in the hagiographic literature in the 6th and 7th century. One can observe that John of Ephesus, so it is a mistake here, it's not John of Edessa, John of Ephesus tells about a pilgrim woman named Mary whose encounter with Golgotha makes her stand in spiritual ecstasy for 3 days in front of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Another monk's life that mentions a pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre and the further travel to Egypt is that of Theodota of Amida, 7th century personality, pilgrim to the Holy City, who performs also miracles as an imitator of Christ. Beyond any tendency, these are without doubt some examples showing a trend of interest and compatibility between the profiles of monks or saints and holy places. On the contrary, it seems that a phenomenon of counteracting this trend becomes apparent, coupled with attempts by Syriac church leaders to control the phenomenon of Syriac pilgrimage to the Holy City in favor of establishing the primacy of local tradition. I briefly mention here 3 examples. The West Syriac theologian and bishop Philoxenos of Mabug died 523, who writes that, quote, one who goes to this holy monastery of Cartamin, Mor Gabriel in Turabdin, 7 times with faith is like he who goes to Jerusalem, unquote. This is the letter to Astorchius. Probably Philoxenos' statement might be that this is a remark that comes to highlight the importance of the monastery around the year 500. Another example is the East Syriac Catholicos Ishaab I. In his letter to Jacob of Dirin from 585, the patriarch's rhetoric is based on the idea that Syriac pilgrims to Palestine left their own churches and monasteries behind, which caused tangible social and economic issues for the ecclesiastical authorities. Quote, if they think that God might hear them better there and would be more responsive to them and fulfill their request and accept their offerings, then their hope is deceived in them, unquote. A similar idea indicates Canon 12 of a council held under Syriac I from the same year, from 585, which warns against the tendency of traveling abroad, thereby neglecting donations to the churches and monasteries that were already part of the local community. And the third example is that of Rabban Hormiz, an important figure of Syriac monasticism, who founded the Rabban Hormiz Monastery in Alcoș in 640. After receiving a dream, the monk Hormiz wished to travel to the holy places. On his journey, he met 3 monks from the monastery of Barita, who invited him to join their monastery and become already from this life, quote, the likeness of the celestial Jerusalem, which is the mother of the saints, unquote. And he abandoned his initial plan, which coincides with the trend described above of a substitution of spiritual journey to Jerusalem with entering and participating to local monastic tradition. The motive of traveling to Jerusalem persists in Syriac monastic literature even later. We see the Pilgrim title in a few monks' biographies in the histories composed by Thomas of Marga and Ishodenach of Basra, 2 authors from the 9th century. Some contains also brief narratives of a few sentences, most often bereft of detail, about the journey to Jerusalem and the Egyptian desert. Scholars, notably Florence Julian and others, have argued that the monastic pilgrim route contained 3 stages or destinations: Jerusalem, the Sinai, and at least the desert of Cetis, which basically fits with what we see in the travel itineraries contained in the Historia Monastica and Liber Castitatis. The evidence here shows that pilgrims were passing through the holy city on the way to Egypt. And I would like to draw your attention to this point on some distinctions scholars like David Haberman and Georgia Frank made between different types of pilgrimage in late antiquity. Linear pilgrimages or journeys with a singular destination, thus to holy sites in antiquity, and circular pilgrimages establishing these were actually addressed to holy people. This point of view is very appealing because both are present in Thomas of Marga's Historia Monastica and Ishodenach's of Basra Liber Castitatis. We see linear pilgrimages in which monks travel to Jerusalem as a singular destination. On the other side, there have been circular pilgrimages that make them often deviate from their goal and follow the itinerary to many different destinations, as for example, to living saints of the time or to other shrines, to sites associated with the prophets Moses and Elijah, or to sites of Egyptian monasticism, or to other shrines. One attraction was also the grave of John the Baptist in the city of Emesa. This is what we read in the hagiography that seems to let us understand that the monk's presence in Jerusalem elevates him to the heights of spirituality. As to the travel routes to Jerusalem, we know that the Syriac pilgrims traveled following 2 routes. One itinerary was by land through Nisibis, you can see the map, Edessa, Aleppo, Emesa, Damascus, Jerusalem. And the second option was by land through Nisibis, Edessa, Aleppo until Antioch, then by sea down the eastern Mediterranean coastline to Caesarea or Jaffa, and onwards by land to Jerusalem. With regards to the length and distance, for example, Egeria talks in in the 4th century, about 25 mentions, meaning that one spent 25 nights in different places along the way. At the same time, according to Doctrina Adai, a text from the end of the 5th century, the route took 30 days. This is narrated in the episode about Hanan, the archivist of King Abgar of Edessa, who traveled to Jerusalem between March 14 and April 12. We turn now from hagiographic literature to a more historical and safer ground and talk about Syriac bishoprics in the Holy Land and the Holy City. Referring firstly to East Syriac bishops, we rely on some material, some letters from Ishoiab III. Some details are coming from the East Syriac Catholicos Ishoiab III, who ruled his church in early Islamic times between 649 to 659. Christians in Jerusalem exchanged letters with these East Syriac Catholicos, seeking financial aid from the Catholicos for renovating the ruins of the Holy City. This happened actually after the Persian conquest. In a letter to Bishop Isaac of Nisibis, Ishoiab III told that he sent greetings to some monks from Jerusalem, Melchizedek and Kayuma, and a nun named Pelagi. Another letter addressed to the people of Jerusalem, to the priest Sinkelos Elias, the archdeacon Paulus, and the deacon Mar Theodore, and to the whole clergy of the city of Jerusalem, in which he expressed his regret that his church was so poor and could only offer a small symbolic sum of money along with many prayers. This context makes clear that there has been no East Syriac bishop in Jerusalem in the middle of the 7th century. Further evidence seems to support this point. We read, for example, in letter 47 of Patriarch Timotheus, more than 1 century later, to address to Sergius, the Metropolitan of Elam, about the discovery of some biblical manuscripts in Hebrew in the region of Jericho. On this occasion, Timotheus commissioned a converted Christian named Gabriel and the Metropolitan Shubal Maran of Damascus to carry out further research concerning this matter. I think it's fair to say that if that at that time the East Syrians had no suffragan bishop in the Holy City, but the Metropolitan of Damascus had Jerusalem under his jurisdiction. This finding is also strengthened by what we read in Abdicius' Order of Ecclesiastical Judgments, this book composed in 1315, 1316, that at the election of the Metropolitan of Turkestan in 798, a Metropolitan of Damascus, Jerusalem, and the seacoast already appears as second on the list. And this is certainly a testimony of an East Syriac bishoprics in the Holy Land at that time. If at that time there was no East Syriac bishop with jurisdiction over Palestine, from then on, Timotheus had an additional reason to appoint an early Syriac bishop to the Holy Land. Much later appears Elijah al-Jawari, Metropolitan of Damascus, Jerusalem, and coastline, consecrated in 8093. Much later in 13th century, the title is Metropolitan of Tripoli and Jerusalem. Having looked at the East Syrians, let's now think about the longue durée of West Syriac bishops of Jerusalem. It seems that the West Syrians had a bishop in Jerusalem much earlier than the East Syrians. We rely here on the chronicle of Michael the Syrian. The chronicle enumerates Syriac Orthodox bishops of Jerusalem until Michael time. And here one can note that in the absence of reliable documentation for the period ranging from 638 to the end of the 8th century, Michael Rabo relied on two separate sources that varied. If one look at modern research on this, we see that scholars diverge in illustrating the long list of these bishops of Jerusalem. Otto Meinardus elaborates the list of Michael and illustrates a total of 118 names of bishops from 575 to 1962. Fii observes that Meinardus' enumeration of 118 bishops passes abruptly from 57 to 85, arriving on the date 1511, what in fact should be 1200. Amending this list, Fii opines that the inserted names were additionally borrowed from notes of Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Barsaun. Beyond these discrepancies, what we must understand is that the Syriac Orthodox have possessed a bishop in Jerusalem from early on, and there has been a certain continuity in this sense. To illustrate this point, Michael's Chronicle notes that after the expulsion of Chalcedonian Patriarch Elias in 1516, the Orthodox, which means the Chalcedonians of this city, no longer had a bishop until the time of the Arab rules. This is a quotation from Michael's Chronicle, volume 3. He suggests here that this was a prosperous time for ecclesiastical administration of Syriac Orthodox in Jerusalem, and much later in 11th-12th century, they were raised to the rank of metropolitan, but we do not know for sure if they also had suffragan bishops. Apparently, a West Syriac bishop of Tiberias has been in office between the 9th and 11th century. West Syriac metropolitans of Jerusalem appear sporadically in colophons, pilgrims' notes, or donations to the monastery. Title in manuscripts ties in with what I said earlier, that at a certain point they were raised to the rank of the metropolitan. But in terms of their jurisdiction, it seems obviously that the terms oscillate with different accents on certain cities or adjacent places. And you can read here different titles of the metropolitan, of the Syriac Orthodox Metropolitan of the Holy City, Metropolitan of the Holy City of Jerusalem, that is to say, of the City of the Lord and of all the other cities by the sea. This comes from a Syriac manuscript in Lyon. Metropolitan of Jerusalem and of the seaside, another manuscript from Bibliothèque Nationale de France from Paris. Metropolitan of Jerusalem and Damascus, from another manuscript from Paris. Metropolitan of the Holy of Jerusalem and Syria. This is notated in Syriac manuscript in Leipzig. Metropolitan of the Holy City of Jerusalem and its surroundings, Damascus, Homs, and Tripoli. This appears in a Syriac manuscript from Church of the 40 Martyrs from Martin. Beyond the Mary Magdalene Monastery, which was at the center of the Syriac Orthodox community in the Holy Land, the coastal villages also boasted small communities of Syrians, which can be speculated by reading the titles of the metropolitan. This would consequently suggest that the West Syrians operated a number of small communities in Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli, and along the Syriac pilgrimage routes in the harbor towns of Palestine, thus creating and reinforcing a network in Palestine and beyond. I think it's fair to say that the Syriac metropolitan of the Holy City has a significant position within his church tradition. He appears to be also representative and advisor in delegations in terms of faith. We have the case of Mark Thomas traveling to Constantinople in 969, together with the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch John VII and 3 other metropolitans to ecumenical discussions. We have covered the beginning of Syriac bishoprics in Jerusalem. This leads me now to my next point, which is the Syriac Orthodox Monastery of St. Mary Magdalene. This was founded by an Egyptian Christian, Macarius Nabrua, in the northwest quarter. Please take a look on this map on the slide. In the early 9th century, the monastery has been destroyed and then repaired and became the core of the Syriac community in the Holy City. At a later time, this was dedicated to Simon the Pharisee as well, nevertheless continuing to pay homage to its first patron, which was Mary Magdalene. These Syriac monks of that monastery claimed to be in possession of a hair of Mary Magdalene, discovered on the spot of washing Jesus' feet. The monastery has been the residence of the Syriac Orthodox Bishop of Jerusalem and possessed a hospice and a residence for the Patriarch when he visited Jerusalem. In the 12th century, the monastery was expanded. In 1169, Michael Rabo names it our monastery in Jerusalem in his chronicle. After Saladin's conquest, the monastery still operated for a short time, then it was transformed into a Muslim school, the Maimunia. This relates to what Michael Rabo refers in 1193-1196 to this as the monastery of Mary Magdalene, which we used to possess. I'd like to expand at this point on the importance of the monks from this monastery in Jerusalem. Some monks from the Syriac Orthodox monastery in the Holy City were ordained as bishops in different places at the beginning of the 12th century. For example, Ignatius, Bishop of Kefar Tab, who came from our monastery in Jerusalem. Basilius, Metropolitan of Emit, who also came from the monastery in Jerusalem. I want to turn now to an interesting pilgrim case, the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Michael Rabo in the Holy Land. This was the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch in the 12th century. He traveled twice to Jerusalem. We possess some traces. He lived in medieval manuscripts in the monastery he visited. And with this, I moved to the part of my presentation illustrating Syriac manuscripts. According to his chronicle, after his intronization as patriarch, much probably in 1166, Michael toured Edessa and its surrounding monasteries in a journey to inspect the Syriac Orthodox communities, as was the probable custom following the installation of a new patriarch, and then he traveled to the Holy Land via Cilicia, Antioch, passing through Laodicea and Tyre, and arriving in Jerusalem. This can be a testimony in support of the thesis that Jerusalem was already home to a large Syriac Orthodox community, mostly formed of monks with an already established tradition in the Holy City. The chronicle stresses his rush to reach the Holy City as the Easter celebrations were drawing near. The Patriarch arrived in Jerusalem on Thursday of the Passion Week in the year 1168. Michael prayed at the Holy Sepulchre and celebrated Easter in St. Mary Magdalene Convent, where he also consecrated the Holy Chrism, the Holy Myron. According to his chronicle, he enjoyed the privilege to be received with honors by the Amalric of Nestle, the late Patriarch of Jerusalem. It is likely that this ecumenical encounter led to the concession of the Chapel of St. James in the Holy Sepulchre, which the Syriac Orthodox Christians appear to have been granted sometimes between 1165 and 1173. Later on in 1179, a second pilgrimage of Michael to Jerusalem follows. I would like to draw your attention to this point to an interesting manuscript that shows traces of his second visit. During his presence in Jerusalem, Michael composed a colophon, a note, in this manuscript which belonged to the Syriac Orthodox monastery in Jerusalem. Let me briefly introduce the manuscript. This is manuscript Syriac 64 from Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Its origin goes back before 12th century. It contains pieces of biblical exegesis, and there is a short description in Zottenberg's catalogue. The manuscript has been restored in 1134 in the monastery of Simon the Pharisee during the time of Ignatius Hesnun, the metropolitan, the Syriac Orthodox metropolitan. The manuscript has been transferred then from Jerusalem to Cyprus, being in the possession of a deacon John. I think the pictures, especially that on the left, perfectly shows this, namely that this book belongs to the weak and sinful John by name, a deacon of the powerful city of Cyprus. The question which arises here is why has been the manuscript transferred to Cyprus? The answer should be sought in the context of Saladin's conquest of the whole city, when many West Syriac monks were forced to leave, carrying with them manuscripts from the monastery of St. Mary Magdalene. Some of them probably fled to Cyprus, the island being an important residence for Syriac Orthodox and for communities of Miaphysites, refugees from the 7th century onwards. The argument put forward is strengthened by later pilgrims in Cyprus on their way to Jerusalem who described Syriac churches in Nicosia, as was the case of Sergius of Ac from the 13th century, which I will discuss later on. This was the fate of the manuscript, which then from Cyprus was brought to France, where it has been included in the library of Jean-Baptiste Colbert by Etienne Balouse in 1673, attested by a note. Let the pictures speak for themselves. Let's take now a closer look at the colophon. We read here, Michael, Patriarch, by the infinite mercy of grace, which extends to everything that touches Almighty God. We prescribe by the decision of the living word of apostolic power that nobody takes this book from the interior jurisdiction of our Jerusalem monastery, which bears the name of Saint Mary Magdalene. May peace always reign through its prayers over the Orthodox inhabitants. We wrote with our own hands in the year 1179. According to our findings, a colophon composed by the Patriarch Michael in the Syriac Orthodox monastery appears in a second manuscript. This is Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate 367. As to the origin of the manuscript goes back to the 9th century. The date seems to be May 20, 887. From Jerusalem, number 123, the manuscript has been transferred in 1948 to Homs and thereafter to Damascus. As to the content of Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate 367, this encloses the Dionysian corpus and some further prefaces and notes. A short description can be found in Graf and Drucker. If you look at the picture on the slide, you can see the note at the top left of the page. And I would like to draw your attention to this point that the data here indicates that there is an additional note just below the colophon of Michael. You can see this on the picture. We read here, may the blessed Michael dwell in the bosom of paradise, and the young Bishop Gregory of Jerusalem be remembered by his answered prayers. The dilemma is that in the Syriac Orthodox bishop list, there is no person bearing this name, Gregory, which suggests that this can be a later addition, although the font seems to be more or less similar and almost the same age with the colophon. Here are the colophons in both manuscripts, in the manuscript from Bibliothèque Nationale de France and the other one from Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate. If you look at the slide, you can see that parts of the colophon in Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate 367 are illegible. Probably anyone would wonder why are these two such colophons attesting a visit of a patriarch in the Holy City. Please do not expect that I can fully clarify the entangled history of these colophons. What I can say about that is the hypothesis that one of the colophons has been probably the source for the other, being copied for fear of losing the initial manuscript in the context of the changes within St. Mary Magdalene monastic community during Islamic conquest and the time shortly before, or they refer to different visits of Michael Rabel to Jerusalem. Closing the discussion on these colophons, I would also like to mention that there are a number of studies, especially those of Martin Zottenberg and now, referring to the colophon in Bibliothèque Nationale de France 64, Syriac 64, but these scholars had no knowledge of the colophon in Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate 367. Beyond the tricky question regarding the transmission history of these colophons and the cultural transfer of the manuscripts, what one should argue on this point is that both colophons testify indeed the presence of the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Michael Rabel in Jerusalem and the vigor of this community and monastery during that period when, according to Bar Hebreus, 90 monks lived in the monastery. The next point I am going to discuss relates again to the figure and context of Michael Rabel in regards to a tension and relation with the Syriac Orthodox monk and theologian of his time, Bar Wabun. This Theodore Bar Wabun, entering into a conflict with the Patriarch Michael, seeks refuge in Jerusalem and reveals details about the power relations among the Eastern communities in the Holy City. Theodore Bar Wabun was a monk and a rebel character. He was expelled from monastic communities in Melitene, Edessa, and Jerusalem, according to the Chronicle of Michael Rabel. He became a secretary at Synkelos of Michael Rabel. Then Bar Wabun was a scholar in Syriac, Greek, Armenian, and Arabic, being engaged in ecumenical discussions with Byzantines and Armenians. Rebelling against his patriarch, he was driven out of Bar Sauma monastery. Then he sought refuge in Jerusalem and fomenting a dispute against Michael Rabel when Metropolitan of Jerusalem was Athanasius Libo, the brother of the Patriarch, enthroned much probably in 1184. After 1187, Theodore was ordained as Syriac Orthodox counter-patriarch in Cilicia with the support of the Armenian king. This Theodore arrives in Jerusalem when it seems that, as we read in Syriac Anonymous Chronicle, he caused much harm to the convent and trouble to the bishop and monks, including Socto de Desenian, who became bishop at the death of Athanasius and was named Ignatius. A similar description gives also Michael in his chronicle that the Syriac community in Jerusalem was not without problems and tensions due to the presence of Wabun in its midst. It is interesting to note how Theodore arrives in Jerusalem and how he continues to communicate with the Patriarch, what goals he pursues, and what was the context of ecclesiastical power in the Holy City. To illustrate this point, I will rely on two interesting letters of Theodore Bar Wabun. These are kept in a manuscript of Church of the 40 Martyrs 324, copied by Johanna Dolabani. One of them was addressed to John, Metropolitan of Tarsus, and the other to Patriarch Michael himself. Bar Wabun's first letter to the Metropolitan of Tarsus recounts the events of his conflict with Michael in his criticism regarding the flaws of in ecclesiastic procedure by which Michael was elected anointed patriarch and Wabun's abusive removal from the priesthood. Then the author mentions that when he arrived in Jerusalem, he found shelter by the Armenians, only to be later cast out by the Catholicos in a string of humiliating experience. He was expelled and had to live with beggars and strangers in the valley of Jehoshaphat, Kedron Valley, outside the city. He then turned to the late Patriarch, who offered him the West Syriac See of Jerusalem, but he refused the offer and remained living as a guest among foreign peoples. The accent is somehow different in the letter to Michael, where he recounts again his arrival in Jerusalem and how the Patriarch attempted to plot against him, writing to Latin Patriarch. Quote, "From there we came to Jerusalem and settled in the Armenian monastery. We were received with great honors by the superiors, but because of your letters to the Catholicos, we were expelled from there and from the monastery where we had been welcomed. We composed songs of lamentation about our humiliation. When the Catholicos of the Romans returned from Rome, your holy bishop turned to him, presented him with many arguments, and blinded his eyes. Then he made promises about our expulsion and therefore called us to him." Unquote. Then it continues, "When we were brought before him, he tracked down the matter concerning us as appropriate, but when Athanasius, the bishop of the Armenians," this is a mistake in the manuscript, it should be the Syrians, "came to his senses and realized the damage, we went out free. After the shepherds had taken counsel, we remained with him, not by our request and petition, but by the will of God, and not by the strong hand of those in power, but his brotherly consent and in peace and love." Let's summarize briefly what we have read in these passages. Once Theodore arrived in the Holy City, he first sought refuge in an Armenian monastery, a more or less conciliatory community with the Syrians. Then, against the backdrop of more or less friendly relationship between the West Syrians and the Latin Christians, Theodore also attempted to gather support from the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, a detail also preserved by the letters. This is perhaps unsurprisingly, since his status as a fugitive very likely made him open to pursuing any avenues of securing concrete assistance for his ecclesiastic ascent. Beyond the entangled power relations of communities in the Holy City, Wabun also had to contend with other issues stemming from the fact that Michael Rabo enjoyed an erstwhile supporter in Jerusalem in the person of his brother Athanasius, Bishop of Jerusalem, who had probably already been appointed to the position by the time Bar Wabun arrived in the Holy City, which likely occurred around 1184. Bar Wabun criticizes comes down to, and he shows in the end of the letter, a conciliatory position, even inviting Michael to come to Jerusalem. But what concerns us in the following passage is what was urgently needed to be resolved as regards to the situation of the monastery. Bar Wabun views a potential visit of the Patriarch Michael to the Holy City as a requirement for resolving the issues of the local Syriac community. It is not clear what sort of issue Wabun was referring to. Of note, Wabun's relation with the Patriarch appears entirely different, with him promising obedience to Patriarch Michael and to other church authorities, more broadly even offering to initiate and prepare Michael's arrival to the Holy City with the local church authorities, especially the Latin Patriarch, such that Michael can enjoy the great honor of a worthy welcome. And were the Patriarch unable to travel to Jerusalem, Wabun offers an alternative that he might instead delegate 3 or 4 other bishops to resolve the issue of the monastery in Jerusalem. It is likely that the Syriac Orthodox community, and especially the monastery, faced at that time litigation with the Frankish authorities, as we shall see, or otherwise were subjected to inordinate taxation or other burdens that weighed heavily on them. Moreover, there could also have been discontent regarding the election of the abbot of the Syriac Monastery, likely Sofdo of Edessa, whom Wabun blames for the monastery's taxation. My next section is in regard to the power relations of the Syriac Orthodox community in the Holy City, and to illustrate a fragment of this entangled history, we rely on two colophons. The first one is contained in the manuscript Syriac I from Bibliothèque Municipale de Lyon, dated before 12th century. Let me firstly introduce the manuscript. If you look at the slide, you can see three pictures with this ornamented manuscript containing a reed led in rubrications and decoration, and with an aesthetical full-page miniature of a cross as the heading of the book. The manuscript has been a book of daily offices used in the Church of Aleppo. It was offered by the Syriac Catholic Archeparchy of Aleppo to Laurent d'Arviot, French consul of Aleppo, on December 2nd, 1684, who gave it to the city of Lyon. A short description and discussion can be found in Briquel Chatonnet, P. Martin, and Andrew Palmer. The colophon was composed by a monk named Michael on 10th of February 1138 in the convent on St. Mary Magdalene and Simon the Pharisee during the time of Ignatius II, Syriac Orthodox Metropolitan of Jerusalem. On the slide you can see this, and also a wonderful scribal decoration with two interesting figural crosses representations, and the content that reads, this book was written by a sinner named Michael, who wears wool and came from the province and the administration of the city of Marash, and belongs to the famous convent of Mar Gheorghis, otherwise known as Gazeliut in the Black Mountains. As to the content of the colophon, this monk Michael informs about two properties: the villages of Beit Arif and Adasia, which the Syriac Orthodox monastery in Jerusalem regained from a Frankish Crusader. He makes also evidence of how, when the Syriac Orthodox Metropolitan Cyril had fled to Egypt, this around 1100, the Frank Geoffrey Plantagenet, former Count of Anjou, seized the properties from the monastery. While the Frank being captive in Egypt, Syriac Orthodox presented eyewitness that they were deprived of their rightful property, and then the King Baldwin I returned them the estates after they paid a high quantity of gold. The story continues, and according to the scribe, after Geoffrey's liberation, he petitioned the king that the Jacobites had to pay him a high sum of money for the profits lost during the years in which he had been imprisoned. The dispute reached the king's court, and Queen Melisende, with ancestors in Melitene, was amenable to supporting the Syriac Orthodox inhabitants of the Holy City, and thanks to this, the Syriac Orthodox community came out victorious in the end. This story and other cases in which Metropolitan Ignatius himself relied on similar connections with the local power holders testify that the Syriac Orthodox Christians of Jerusalem has been a dynamic and influent community in the city's entangled political relations. Let's take now a closer look at the second colophon, and on the same matter. This appears in the manuscript Paris 51 from Bibliothèque Nationale de France, dated before 12th century. The colophon was composed by another monk named Romanos on the 25th of August 1138, This means 6 months after the first colophon, in the convent of the Holy City of Jerusalem during the time of Metropolitan Mar Ignatius II. The scribe starts his colophon as usual with information about the book, the copyist, and his milieu. This gospel, or to speak more aptly, this lectionary was completed in the convent in the Holy City of Jerusalem in the year 1138, on the 25th of the month of August, by the last of the monks, the very unworthy priest Romanus, secretary of our Father Mar Ignatius, metropolitan of the said place and of the seaside, by whose spiritual care this volume was writing. And he himself, so the metropolitan, corrected it, the book, because it is the first book that I copied. So Romanus' account offers more details and describes the building infrastructure of his community in the Holy City. He also highlights the history of the villages, which I mentioned before, and describes the same dispute with the Frankish Crusader Geoffrey. Then he also informs about the release of the Frank Geoffrey from Egypt and how was the process, the judge and the litigation then resolved. Another important aspect is to be found in the last part of the colophon, where Romanus also praised Melisande for her intervention in the favor of the Syriac Orthodox community, and also the scribe makes an account of Bishop Ignatius' death in Acre on the Thursday before Pentecost, 1138. The author underlined here the intrinsic link between the Syriac bishop and his community, telling that the Syriac Orthodox community mourned the church leader's death. I would now like to move on to the next part of my talk, dealing with colophons and travel reports of Syriac medieval pilgrims to Jerusalem. It seems that pilgrimage appears as prioritization in a practiced Christian life of lay people and monks in a medieval period. To give you an example, in 950, two Syrian nuns made devotion in Jerusalem. With this occasion, they donated to the Syriac Orthodox Monastery a manuscript. This can be read in the colophon, Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate 367. We read here, Hannah, superior of a monastery, and the nun Azisto, her companion, offered this book to the church of the Jacobites in the city of Jerusalem, that may God pardon them and their departed relatives, and may he write their names in heavenly Jerusalem. This was dedicated in my days, and by me, I, Jeremiah, the weak among strangers, in my capacity as the metropolitan of the sea. I have affirmed by the word of the living word of the Lord that no one has the power to remove it from its mentioned place or to erase this remembrance in 1950 AD. Based on this and other similar cases, we can argue for a standardized and even institutionalized phenomenon in this period. A possible parallel might be found in Thomas of Marga's history of the abbots of Bet-Abbé, where he recounts a brief tale of two women from Bet-Begash who went to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, and this can also be circumscribed to this same category of female Syriac pilgrims. This mobility and the act of participation in the common goal and the collective memory of the pilgrims and to gain spiritual progress is sometimes seen also in the donors' initiatives to be in permanent spiritual binding with holiness by making use of intercessory prayers. This appears in a wonderful illuminated liturgical manuscript from the 13th century from the Church of the 40 Martyrs, numbered 37, an expensive manuscript adorned with pictures decorated with silver and gold, a magnificent chrysography. This belongs to a limited group of illuminated manuscripts. You can see here the pilgrim and the intercessory prayer request to the Mother of God to pray for God's mercy on the servant Abu Ishaq. Another selected example of a colophon I bring to your attention is a note of a Syriac reader, Jacob from Jerusalem, from 1493, contained in Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate 367. The Pilgrim gives information about his person, the book, and the milieu. This book was found by Jacob of Jerusalem in the wilderness, probably in a monastery in the Egyptian desert, in Monastery Deir al-Surian, in 1493, and it belongs to the Syriac Church of the Mother of God in Jerusalem. I ask for the prayers of those who will examine it. To him, to God, be glory. Amen. One of the few detailed pilgrim reports, and the most interesting one, belongs to the priest and monk Sergius from Hag in Turabdin, nowadays southeastern Turkey. He made 2 pilgrimages to Jerusalem in 4089, respectively in 50 and 2. As a monk in the Monastery of the Cross in Turabdin, after his pilgrimages, he became the Bishop of Hag in 1505 and died in 1508. His travel report appears in the manuscript St. Mark's Monastery, Jerusalem, 291. The manuscript is dated in 15th century and belonged to the chapel of the Syriac Orthodox at the Holy Sepulchre. The report describes the first pilgrimage of Sergius from 4089 and is important because it gives details about the sacred geography of the Holy City. We learn from the report that he traveled in a group with secular people and officials who collected the taxes. Before Tripoli, Sergius visited Cyprus and St. Mary Church of the Syrians in Nicosia, and this relates to what I was saying earlier about the relationship of Syriac Orthodox Christians with Cyprus from the 7th century onwards. Sergius' report focuses primarily on recounting visual elements. He describes what he saw, where he stopped, without offering any spiritual perceptions that might lead us to an understanding of the spiritual process of Syriac pilgrim on the road to the Holy City. He passed through Acre, Tyre, Caesarea Philippi, Jaffa, then went to Bethlehem and Jerusalem. In the Holy City, he mentions visits to Sion, Tomb of David, Tomb of Stephen, Mary's Tomb, Cave of David, which, according to him, is the monastery of the Ethiopians, the Sion, which belongs to the Franks, and the house of Caiaphas, which belongs to the Armenians, according to him, and a multitude of other places of reference in the Gospels. Another significant point in his report is that the author tips the balance of his arguments in favor of the Syriac tradition, which permeates the text in multiple places. For example, here the well-known tradition of the letter exchange between Jesus and Abgar is narrated discreetly when referring to the place where Christ was sitting when he read the message sent to him by the king of Edessa. He refers to the Syriac legend of Abgar, making it part of the pilgrimage. And by referring the legend of Abgar's correspondence with Jesus, the Syrians demonstrate how important the argument of tradition was for them. Being physically in the Holy City, they did not hesitate to connect the history of their church with the biblical framework of the holy places. And even if they are in Jerusalem, they do not cease to be from the perspective considering to whom they traditionally belong in Edessa as well. It should be emphasized that Sergius mentions the motif of the holy light as part of the devotional program of the pilgrim, which actually demonstrates that Syriac pilgrimages to Jerusalem culminated around the period of Easter. And you can read here the point in Sergius' report. Then if you look at this picture, you can see an inscription on as traces of his presence at the Holy Sepulchre. His name, profession, and origin appear on the columns of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. One reads here, Sargis, monk from Hag, Sargis Tairia Hachia. Many medieval pilgrims left their names inscribed on the pillars at the entrance to the Holy Sepulchre. On the one hand, as an act of participation in the common goal and collective memory of the pilgrims, that is to say, they wanted to stay in permanent spiritual binding with the origin of the holiness, even after the pilgrimage is over. And as was the pilgrims' custom, Sargis also made a note in a lectionary in a manuscript in Jerusalem. This is Damascus Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate. I didn't put a picture here. Olim Syriac St. Mark's Monastery of Jerusalem 25. Have mercy, O Lord, on the soul of your servant Sargis the monk from Hag, the Oriental who visited your tomb in 1490 of the Greeks, and the second time in 1502 of the. I move now from Sargis' report to further traces of Syriac pilgrims, and I would like to briefly draw your attention to another pilgrim, to Adai of Beth Sbirino. He accomplished his pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1492, accompanied by priests, monks, and lay people, traveling with a caravan under the protection of the Emir of Mardin, with the scope to receive the holy light and to get a blessing from the Holy Sepulchre and from the holy places. And we also have an inscription of his name at the entrance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And beyond the story of the pilgrim Adai, there are many notes and colophons attesting Syriac pilgrims in Jerusalem in later periods, mostly in 16th, 17th century, and also a lot of notes of donations. They donate the silver items, crosses, or sponsored manuscripts restorations. And an interesting colophon is attesting the phenomenon of pilgrimage, and this can be seen on the slide. It contains two notes of the pilgrim Abdisho Fatel from 6043 and 6050. The colophon was included in the manuscript St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem, 181, that contains, interestingly, the first part of Isaac of Nineveh, the holy book of Mar Isaac of Beneficial Discourse. A last point I want to mention in relation to these pilgrims is the generic title Magdalene that appears in some manuscripts as an epithet to people engaged in the journey to make devotion in the holy city. And I draw here your attention to Kaufholz's point. He indicates in an excellent article and make an association of this genuine title Magdasaya in Syriac with many other correspondents in Arabic, Magdisi, and Armenian Maktesi. And I included here a picture with a later manuscript with a colophon about a pilgrim named Mary from Mosul, who sponsored a monk, George, to restore a book for the Church of the St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem in 1555. The title is written here in a short format and added to the pilgrim's name. We encounter also further mentions of this title Magdasaya in Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate 352, and interestingly, this appears also in a colophon of a manuscript containing the famous book of Bar Hebreus, Candelabra of Sanctuary in Vatican Syriac 168, with a mention this book entitled lamp of the sanctuary was brought by Magdasi Hermes, son of Magdasi Garabet. So the epithet was very used to denote pilgrims to Jerusalem. This brings me now to the last point of my presentation. I know that the time of the presentation has already passed, but just to round the talk off, I will mention here some canons as evidence about how the pilgrimage look like, what conditions should they fulfill, and what aspiration they have in order to fit into the canon of the pilgrim. So these canons are part of a memra, chapter 9 from the book of Ethics, composed by Gregorius Barhebreus in 1279. Barhebreus was the most important Syriac Orthodox writer and theologian and encyclopedist of the Syriac Renaissance. Firstly, he discussed actually two opinions of perfect solitaries that were actually looking to reach the Jerusalem on high. They were interested much more on this, and common people that had the aspiration to make the pilgrimage to see the walls of earthly holy city. Barhebreus was an author and bishop of literary authority, and his canons actually aim to make the pilgrimage into a means of spiritual gain for the pilgrim and not a peril for the very life. And here you can see the canons guiding the pilgrims, how to start the journey, about the finances, no trade activities on the way, it recommends also decency, and these are low ends of begging. About the travel time, this happens before the resurrection, how the people should recite psalms while walking or riding, and also some aspects of the liturgical manifestation in the holy city. How the pilgrims should read psalms in front of the holy city, then at the entrance in Jerusalem, at the entrance into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and very interesting about the dress code for the Easter celebrations, and how the pilgrims should pray and meditate at every biblical holy site, and what they should do when they are taking the road back to Mesopotamia. The last point I would like to emphasize ties in with a picture we encountered in the hagiography material, to be in favor of the local tradition that can in fact substitute the Holy City. And I just presented you in the first part of my talk how some Syriac leaders position themselves against this trend of making pilgrimages to the Holy City. We find a similar point in a later text. This is the life of Yabalaha and Rabban Sauma from 14th century. Two monks from Peking took the way to Jerusalem after they paid devotion in different churches in Mesopotamia. Then they met the Catholicos Mardenha, and in the end they changed their plan. The Catholicos cautioned against the excess of pilgrimages to Jerusalem and recommended to these two pilgrims that they should put actually all their enthusiasm and effort for their local tradition. And this text actually is very interesting. You can read on the slide. This is no time to travel to Jerusalem because the roads are troubled and routes interrupted, but you have received blessing from all the houses of God and the shrines within them. And in my opinion, if one visits them with a pure heart, the benefits will not be inferior to those from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So this fits actually with other texts from 7 or 8 centuries earlier, with the opinion of Philoxenos and Joab, and actually this is very actual also for the situation today. In conclusion, In late antique and medieval period and beyond, Jerusalem is a matrix for encountering holiness. The Holy City acted as a stage in the formation of the monk. The fluidity of Syriac trajectory toward Jerusalem becomes more accentuated in the late Middle Ages, as the colophon testify, and the standardized and stable pilgrimage process, it becomes a tradition, and the pilgrims already differentiated from the ordinary people by the appellation Magdalene, being pilgrims and donors at the holy places. And here are a few pictures with the Monastery of St. Mark, the core of Syriac Orthodox identity in the Holy City today. According to tradition, Syriac Orthodox monastery lies on the site of that house, on the site of Mary's house, believed supported allegedly by a 6th century inscription discovered in 1940, and which can still be seen today in the monastery's church. There are also scholars who actually suspect that this is not a 6th century but a much later inscription. On the picture on the right side, you can see this inscription. Okay, I think now the talk is over. Thank you very much for your attention.